In the quiet streets of Oakland, California, a shocking act of cruelty is about to unfold when a notorious gang targets what they think is a helpless disabled veteran. They believe they're dealing with just another easy victim. They couldn't be more wrong. Marcus Thompson isn't your typical target. For 25 years, he was a decorated Army Ranger who lost both legs serving his country in Afghanistan. His quiet dignity and daily struggles have made him a beloved figure in the neighborhood. But his son, Jake Thompson, isn't your average protective family member. For 15 years, he was one of the most elite Navy SEALs in U.S. military history, specializing in direct action missions that would never see the light of day. His call sign was Ghost, a silent guardian who struck without warning and vanished without a trace. This is not just another street story. This is about how the most dangerous gang in Oakland learned the hard way that some veterans never stop protecting their own. When they came for his father, they didn't realize they were about to face the wrath of a warrior trained to eliminate threats before they even knew he was there. What follows is the story of how one man's love for his father would teach an entire gang why you never target a veteran's family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Marcus Thompson's small apartment on Elm Street, casting warm light across his carefully organized living space. At 58, Marcus moved through his morning routine with military precision, despite the wheelchair that had been his companion for the past 8 years. His hands were weathered and scarred, but steady as he prepared his breakfast. Every movement was deliberate, efficient, a reflection of the soldier he'd always been, even after losing his legs to an IED in Kandahar. "Morning, Dad," Jake's voice crackled through the phone speaker. Marcus smiled at the sound of his son's voice, though the connection was often interrupted by poor signal from wherever Jake was deployed, currently somewhere in the Middle East on another classified mission. "Morning, son. How are things on your end?" Jake's voice was careful, professional. Even with family, operational security was never relaxed. "Can't say much, but we're keeping busy. What about you? How's the physical therapy going?" "Getting stronger every day," Marcus replied, adjusting the position of his wheelchair to reach his coffee cup. "Dr. Martinez says I'm making good progress with the new prosthetics. Should be walking again soon." "That's what I like to hear, Dad." Jake's pride was evident even through the static field connection. "You're the strongest man I know, always have been. Listen, I know this is hard, being there alone. If you need anything at all, you call me, understand?" "I can handle myself, son," Marcus chuckled, but the warmth in his voice was unmistakable. 25 years in the Rangers didn't teach me to give up easy. Besides, Mrs. Garcia next door checks on me, and the neighborhood kids help with groceries. They're good people here, Jake. "Just remember, you raised the SEAL, Dad." Jake's voice carried that familiar protective edge. "We take care of our own, no matter what it takes." After ending the call, Marcus wheeled himself to the window overlooking the street below. The neighborhood had changed over the years. Once a thriving working-class area, it had gradually fallen under the influence of the Crimson Serpents, a gang that had moved in from the east side. Their red bandanas and intimidating presence had driven out many longtime residents, but Marcus had refused to leave. This was his home, the place where he'd raised Jake after his wife passed away, the place where he'd learned to rebuild his life after his injury. The first sign of trouble came around noon. Marcus was returning from his weekly visit to the VA hospital, navigating his wheelchair down the sidewalk, when he noticed them. 4 young men in red hoodies leaning against the wall of the convenience store. Their eyes followed him with the predatory focus he recognized from his military days. They were sizing him up, calculating. "Look what we got here," one of them called out as Marcus approached. His route to his apartment building required passing right by their position. An old soldier boy in his little chair. The speaker was tall and lean, with the kind of swagger that came from running these streets for years. His name was Carlos Rodriguez, though everyone called him Viper, the local lieutenant for the Crimson Serpents. Marcus kept his eyes forward, his military training telling him to avoid confrontation when possible, but his instincts were already calculating distances, angles, potential threats. The wheelchair limited his mobility, but his upper body strength was formidable. Years of physical therapy and gym work had built muscle mass that most people wouldn't expect from a man his age. "Excuse me," Marcus said politely as he approached. "Just trying to get home." "Oh, he's polite," Carlos laughed, nudging his companion, a heavyset kid they called Brick. "This is our street, old man. You want to pass, you pay the toll." "I'm not looking for trouble," Marcus replied calmly but firmly. "Just want to get to my apartment." But Carlos wasn't done. He'd built his reputation on intimidation, on breaking people down, and this old soldier was challenging that reputation simply by refusing to be intimidated, by maintaining his dignity in the face of threats. "Your country," Carlos sneered. "What did your country do for you when you came back broken, huh? Left you in a chair begging for scraps, just like it does to all you soldier boys." The comment hit deeper than Marcus let show, but his face remained impassive. Years of combat and leadership had taught him to compartmentalize emotions, to think tactically, even in personal situations. "You don't know what you're talking about, son, and I'm not looking for a fight. I just want to go home." But Carlos wasn't done. He'd built his reputation on intimidation, on breaking people down, and this old soldier was challenging that reputation simply by refusing to be intimidated, by maintaining his dignity in the face of threats.
Brick Carlos called to his companion. "Bring that chair over here. Let's see what our broken soldier boy does when he can't roll away." The threat was clear and immediate. Marcus's wheelchair wasn't just his mobility, it was his independence, his connection to a normal life. Losing it would strand him, make him completely vulnerable. But as Brick moved toward him, Marcus's military training kicked in. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Marcus said, his voice carrying a new quality, something that made all 4 gang members pause unconsciously. Carlos recovered first, pushing down the instinctive wariness that Marcus's tone had triggered. "You threatening me, old man? You gonna fight us from that chair?" Marcus looked up at Carlos, his eyes carrying the weight of 2.5 decades of military service, of missions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, of leading men in combat situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. "I'm not threatening anyone," Marcus said calmly. "I'm making a simple statement. You don't want to do this." But the gang members had gone too far to back down now, especially with other residents watching from windows, understanding that their reputation was on the line. Carlos nodded to his crew. "Brick, take his chair. Phantom, grab his wallet and phone. Let's show this neighborhood what happens when you don't show respect." The attack came quickly, but not quickly enough for someone with Marcus's training. As Brick reached for his wheelchair, Marcus's hands shot out with surprising speed, one grabbing Brick's wrist, the other striking precisely at a pressure point that sent the heavy gang member stumbling backward. "What the—" Carlos started, but Marcus was already moving. With a fluid motion that belied his seated position, Marcus grabbed the wheels of his chair and spun it sideways, using the momentum to swing his entire body weight into Carlos's legs. The gang leader stumbled, giving Marcus the opening he needed to grab Carlos's shirt and pull him down to eye level. "Listen carefully," Marcus said, his voice deadly quiet. "I've killed better men than you in places you can't pronounce. I've led soldiers through hell and back, and I've survived things that would break your mind. I'm asking nicely one more time. Let me go home." For a moment, Carlos saw something in Marcus's eyes that made him understand this wasn't just an old man in a wheelchair. This was a warrior who'd learned to adapt, to overcome, to survive. But pride and reputation wouldn't let him back down. "You're going to regret that, old man," Carlos snarled as he broke free from Marcus's grip. "Nobody puts hands on me. Nobody." The fight that followed was brief but brutal. Marcus used every advantage his chair provided, spinning it to avoid attacks, using the wheels as weapons when the gang members got too close. But 4 against 1 was difficult odds, even for someone with his training. Phantom managed to grab the chair from behind, while Carlos and the 4th member Tank attacked from the front. Marcus fought with everything he had, his fists connecting with precision, but the numbers were against him. "Get his chair!" Brick Carlos shouted, still nursing a split lip from Marcus's initial attack. "If he wants to be a hero so bad, let's see how heroic he feels crawling home." "No," Marcus shouted, as they lifted him bodily from his wheelchair, setting him on the concrete beside it. "Don't do this!" "Too late, old man," Carlos sneered, as Brick raised a baseball bat that had appeared from somewhere. "We're going to teach this whole neighborhood what happens when you disrespect the Crimson Serpents." The sound of aluminum crushing under the baseball bat echoed through the street. Marcus watched in horror as his mobility, his independence was systematically destroyed, each blow destroying months of saving for the specialized equipment that insurance barely covered. "Please," Marcus said for the first time, his voice cracking slightly. "That chair, it's custom-made. It took me 8 months to get approved for it." "Good," Carlos replied between bat swings. "Maybe next time you'll remember who runs these streets." When they finished, the wheelchair was a twisted wreck of metal and padding, completely unusable. The gang members stood over Marcus, who remained on the concrete, unable to do more than watch the destruction of his independence. "This is what happens when you don't know your place," Carlos announced, loud enough for the watching neighbors to hear. "Next time might be worse." As they walked away laughing and high-fiving each other, Marcus struggled to pull himself toward his apartment building, his legs useless, his arms bearing his full weight. The indignity was almost worse than the physical challenge. Mrs. Garcia, an elderly woman from the building, rushed out with her teenage grandson, Miguel. They helped Marcus to his apartment, Miguel carrying the pieces of the wheelchair that might be salvageable. "I'm calling the police," Mrs. Garcia said, her voice shaking with anger. "This is terrible, Marcus, what they did. It's criminal." "No police," Marcus said firmly. "They can't prove anything, and it'll only make things worse for everyone. The Serpents will retaliate against anyone who talks." But Miguel was already on his phone, not calling the police, but making a different call. "Mr. Thompson, I know you said no police, but what about family? Shouldn't we call your son? Let him know what happened?" Marcus looked at the twisted remains of his wheelchair, then at Mrs. Garcia's concerned face, finally at Miguel, who was holding the phone, waiting for permission. After a long moment, Marcus nodded. "Call Jake," Marcus said quietly. "Tell him what happened, but tell him not to do anything stupid. I can handle this." As Miguel made the call, Marcus pulled himself onto his couch, using upper body strength built through years of adaptive training. He stared out the window at the street where the attack had occurred, where his dignity had been stripped away along with his mobility. 3,000 miles away in a forward operating base in Syria, Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson was finishing a briefing with his SEAL team when his encrypted phone buzzed. The caller ID showed Miguel's number from Oakland, which was unusual enough for Jake to step away from his teammates. "Miguel, what's wrong?" Jake asked immediately, his tactical mind already shifting into high alert mode. "You never call unless something has happened to Dad." "Mr. Jake," Miguel's voice was tight with emotion, "it's your father. He's okay, but something bad happened. The gang members, the ones in red, they destroyed his wheelchair."
Jake's world stopped. The busy sounds of the military base faded to nothing as Miguel's words sank in. He'd spent his entire adult life protecting his country, protecting his teammates, protecting strangers in foreign lands, but he hadn't been there when his father needed protection most. "Tell me everything," Jake said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had earned him respect in the special operations community. Miguel's description of the attack played out in Jake's mind like a tactical briefing. Target assessment, threat evaluation, response options. "Is Dad hurt physically?" Jake asked when Miguel finished his account. "Some bruises from being lifted out of the chair and from pulling himself home," Miguel replied. "But Mr. Thompson, he's different now. Quiet in a way that scares me. The wheelchair wasn't just equipment to him, you know? It was his freedom." "I understand," Jake said. And he did. The wheelchair represented everything his father had fought to regain after his injury.
independence, dignity, the ability to live life on his own terms. Destroying it was like attacking his father's soul. "He told me to tell you not to do anything stupid," Miguel added nervously. "Said he could handle this himself." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his mind already working through logistics, travel time, operational considerations. "Miguel," Jake said finally, "I want you to do something for me. I want you to stay close to Dad, help him with whatever he needs, shopping, errands, anything at all. Can you do that?" "Of course, Mr. Jake," Miguel replied. "But what are you going to do?" Jake looked around the forward operating base, at his teammates preparing for their next mission, at the equipment that had been his life for 15 years, at the world of classified operations and dangerous missions that had defined him as a man. "I'm coming home," Jake said simply. "Some things are more important than any mission." 2 hours later, Jake was in his team leader's office requesting emergency leave. The conversation was brief, professional, and ended with Jake boarding a military transport within 6 hours. He was airborne, heading for the United States, carrying nothing but a small bag and the kind of focused intensity that his teammates recognized as dangerous. Jake's reputation in the special operations community was legendary. Ghost, they called him, not just for his ability to move unseen, but for his surgical precision in eliminating threats. He'd conducted over 200 classified operations in 15 years of service, from direct action raids to counterterrorism missions. He'd never lost a team member and never left a mission incomplete. But this wasn't about military objectives or national security. This was about family, about a father who'd raised him alone after his mother's death, about a man who'd served his country honorably and deserved better than being victimized by street thugs. As the transport plane crossed the Atlantic, Jake's mind was already working through the problem, the way he'd been trained to approach any tactical situation. Intelligence gathering, threat assessment, operational planning. The Crimson Serpents had no idea what they'd unleashed by targeting Marcus Thompson. The flight gave Jake time to research his targets using military databases and intelligence networks. He built detailed profiles of the gang's leadership structure, territory, and methods. Carlos Rodriguez, aka Viper, had a record going back to juvenile detention, assault, battery, drug dealing, extortion. His crew were similar, career criminals who'd built their reputations on intimidating civilians. What they hadn't counted on was targeting the father of someone who'd spent 15 years learning how to neutralize threats permanently and without leaving evidence. Jake's training included urban warfare, psychological operations, and infiltration techniques that made gang violence look like playground bullying. By the time the plane touched down in California, Jake had a complete operational plan mapped out in his mind. He knew exactly how to dismantle the Crimson Serpents, piece by piece. But first, he needed to see his father, needed to assess the damage, both physical and psychological, that the attack had caused. Jake rented a car at the airport, not the flashy vehicle that might draw attention, but a plain sedan that would blend into the Oakland streets. As he drove through the city, he noted the gang tags, the territorial markers, the signs of Crimson Serpent influence that had spread through the neighborhood like a cancer. When he reached his father's building, Jake sat in the car for a moment, preparing himself mentally. He'd seen war zones, disaster areas, places where violence had torn apart communities, but this was different. This was personal. The man who opened the apartment door was recognizably his father, but diminished in ways that went beyond the missing wheelchair. Marcus was using an old manual chair borrowed from the VA, poorly fitted and clearly inadequate for his needs. More troubling was the look in his eyes, a combination of anger and defeat that Jake had never seen before. "Dad?" Jake said simply, his voice carrying all the love and concern he felt. "Son," Marcus replied, his face showing relief and something else, apprehension, as if he was afraid of what Jake might do. "What are you doing here? You said you were deployed for another month." Emergency leave, Jake replied, stepping into the apartment and noting immediately how different everything looked without the mobility that the custom wheelchair had provided. Things out of reach, simple tasks made complicated. Heard you had some trouble? Trouble. Marcus's laugh was bitter. That's one way to put it, Jake. I want you to promise me something. Promise me you won't do anything that'll get you in trouble with the military. These people aren't worth risking your career. Jake knelt beside his father's chair, bringing them to eye level, the same way Marcus had done when Jake was a child, learning important lessons about right and wrong, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Dad, Jake said quietly, you taught me that family comes first. You taught me that a man stands up for what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Those lessons made me the soldier I am today. Marcus studied his son's face, seeing the boy he'd raised, but also recognizing something else, the hardened professional who'd spent years in the world's most dangerous places. Jake, I know you're angry, but this isn't like your military missions. You can't just eliminate the problem and disappear. There are consequences here, civilian law enforcement. I understand the terrain, Dad, Jake replied, his tactical mind already adapting to the civilian operational environment. But some principles don't change. You don't target veterans. You don't target family. And you sure don't get away with it. Marcus saw the determination in Jake's eyes, the same look he had as a child when he'd decided something was important enough to fight for. He knew there was no talking his son out of whatever he was planning. Just promise me one thing, Marcus said. Be smart about it. These aren't foreign terrorists or enemy combatants. They're American citizens. Even if they're criminals, the rules are different.
Jake nodded, understanding his father's concern, but also knowing that the Crimson Serpents had made a critical error in judgment. They'd attacked a veteran's family, and now they were going to learn why that was the worst mistake they could have made. The rules are different, Dad, Jake agreed. But some things remain constant, like the consequences of picking the wrong target. As the sun set over Oakland, Jake began his reconnaissance, walking the neighborhood, identifying gang territories, counting numbers, noting patterns of movement and behavior. He moved like a shadow, observing everything while remaining invisible to the very people he was studying. The Crimson Serpents had grown comfortable in their territory, confident in their intimidation tactics. They operated openly, conducting business in broad daylight, because no one had ever successfully challenged them. But they'd never faced someone with Jake's training, someone who understood that true power came not from intimidation, but from precision planning and flawless execution. Carlos Rodriguez was holding court outside the same convenience store where he'd confronted Marcus earlier that day. His crew gathered around him as he recounted the story of putting the old soldier in his place. The laughter carried across the street to where Jake watched from the shadows. Tomorrow, Jake would begin teaching them a very different lesson about respect, about consequences, and about the dangers of targeting a Navy SEAL's family. But tonight, he simply watched and planned, cataloging faces, memorizing voices, building the intelligence picture that would guide his operation. The Crimson Serpents thought they were predators, ruling their territory through fear. They were about to discover what it felt like to be hunted by someone who'd perfected the art of warfare in places where mistakes meant death. As Jake returned to his rental car, he placed a call to a secure number, answering on the first ring. "Marcus, what's the word?" His father's voice was tired but alert. "Just doing some sightseeing, Dad," Jake replied, understanding his father's need to know where things stood. "Taking in the local culture, getting familiar with the neighborhood." "Jake?" Marcus's voice carried a warning tone. "Don't worry, Dad," Jake said, starting the car's engine. "Everything is going to be fine. These people made one mistake,
They picked the wrong veteran to mess with. The connection ended, and Jake drove through the Oakland night, past gang territories and civilian neighborhoods, past the lives that these criminals had disrupted with their violence and intimidation. Tomorrow, the balance of power would begin to shift, and the Crimson Serpents would start learning a lesson they'd never forget. Some families you just don't touch, and some soldiers never stop fighting for what's right, even when the battlefield moves from foreign soil to American streets. The hunt was about to begin, and Jake Thompson, the man they called Ghost, was coming for them all.
Jake woke before dawn, as he had every day for 15 years of military service, but this morning was different. Instead of preparing for another classified mission, he was planning an operation on American soil against targets who had no idea they were being hunted. He spent an hour reviewing his intelligence notes, studying street layouts, and finalizing his approach. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, and ensuring his father could live with dignity in his own neighborhood. The first phase began at exactly 0600 hours. Jake positioned himself across from the convenience store where the Crimson Serpents conducted their daily business. From this vantage point, he could observe their patterns, note their security procedures, and identify their weaknesses. After years of hunting high-value targets in hostile territory, a street gang's operational security looked amateur at best. Carlos arrived at 0830, driving a flashy red sports car that screamed drug money. His lieutenant, Brick, followed in an SUV with tinted windows, clearly meant to intimidate the local residents. Jake noted everything: the vehicles, the arrival times, the way they positioned themselves to control the intersection, professional habits from a life spent gathering intelligence on dangerous men. The gang members set up their usual routine, Carlos holding court, while his crew spread out to establish their presence on the block. They were loud, confident, completely unaware they were being watched by someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of observation from concealment. "Time to introduce some chaos into their system," Jake murmured to himself, pulling out his encrypted phone. The first disruption was subtle. Jake had spent hours the previous night researching the gang's operations, discovering they ran drugs through a network of lookouts and runners positioned throughout the neighborhood. Using techniques learned from psychological operations in foreign theaters, he began making anonymous calls to police dispatch. "Anonymous caller reporting suspicious activity on Elm Street," Jake said, altering his voice pattern. "Looks like drug dealing near the convenience store, multiple individuals acting nervous." Within minutes, Oakland PD units were rolling through the area, forcing the Crimson Serpents to scatter and hide their contraband. The routine they had relied on for months was suddenly disrupted by unwanted law enforcement attention. "What the hell?" Carlos snapped into his phone as his crew regrouped 3 blocks away. "Where did the heat come from? Nobody called us about any operation today." Jake watched from a different position now, having moved while they were distracted by the police response. His military training had taught him that disruption was often more effective than direct confrontation. Make the enemy question their security, make them paranoid, and they start making mistakes. Phase 2 began an hour later. Jake had identified the gang's communications pattern. They used burner phones, but followed predictable protocols. Using his knowledge of electronic warfare gained from years of classified operations, he began systematically jamming their frequencies during critical moments. Carlos was trying to coordinate a drug pickup when his phone suddenly went dead, followed by every other Crimson Serpent device in a 2-block radius. The gang members found themselves cut off from each other, unable to verify information or coordinate their activities. "This is impossible," Phantom, one of Carlos's crew, complained, shaking his dead phone. "Nobody can jam our signals like this. We're not using military radios." But Jake was just getting started.
Next, he began exploiting their social media presence. Every gang member posted constantly, documenting their activities, their locations, even their criminal enterprises for the world to see. Jake systematically reported each violation to the platforms, providing detailed documentation of illegal activity. By noon, the Crimson Serpents were dealing with frozen accounts, deleted profiles, and unwanted attention from both law enforcement and social media investigators. Their primary recruitment and communication tool had been turned against them. Carlos paced angrily in the abandoned warehouse they used as a backup meeting location. His crew gathered around him, looking confused and increasingly nervous. "Something is wrong," he declared, scanning the faces of his men. "Someone is targeting us specifically. This isn't random bad luck. This is coordinated." Tank, the largest of his crew, shifted uncomfortably. "Boss, you think it has something to do with that old soldier yesterday, the one with the wheelchair?" Carlos had been wondering the same thing. The timing was too convenient for coincidence. But his intelligence-gathering capabilities were limited to street-level informants and rumors, nothing that could penetrate military operational security. "Nah," Carlos said, but his voice lacked conviction. "What's some broken-down veteran gonna do? Call his army buddies for backup? The military don't get involved in civilian problems."
Jake, monitoring their conversation through surveillance techniques he had learned in counterterrorism operations, smiled grimly at the gang leader's assumptions. They had no understanding of the bonds between military family members or the resources available to someone with his clearance level and training. Phase 3 involved turning their own tactics against them. Jake began spreading carefully crafted disinformation through the gang's network, using techniques perfected in foreign psychological operations. He planted rumors about police informants, about rival gangs moving into their territory, about internal betrayal. The beauty of disinformation, Jake had learned, was that paranoid organizations would do most of the work themselves. Once doubt was introduced, fear would multiply it exponentially. By evening, the Crimson Serpents were questioning each other's loyalty, jumping at shadows, and making increasingly desperate decisions. Their tight organization was fracturing under the pressure of constant disruption and uncertainty. Carlos called an emergency meeting, demanding answers from his crew. But Jake had anticipated this. Using surveillance equipment borrowed from his military contacts, he listened to every word. "I want to know who is doing this," Carlos demanded, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Someone is playing games with us, and when I find out who, they're going to wish they never heard of the Crimson Serpents." From his concealed position, Jake activated a small device that would project his voice directly into the warehouse's acoustic space without revealing his location. The technology was classified, but perfect for this situation. "You already found out who, Carlos." Jake's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, making the gang members spin around trying to locate the source. "You just chose to ignore the warning." "Who are you?" one of the crew members shouted into the empty air. "Show yourself!" Jake's response was cold, professional, carrying the weight of authority earned in the world's most dangerous places. "I'm the consequence of your actions, the price of targeting my father. Yesterday you destroyed something that meant everything to him. Today you learn what that costs." Carlos drew his pistol, signaling for his crew to spread out and search the warehouse. But Jake was already gone, moving through the shadows with skills honed by years of infiltration missions behind enemy lines. "The old man in the wheelchair," Carlos called out, trying to sound defiant. "That was just business, nothing personal." "Everything about that attack was personal," Jake's voice replied, from a different location now, somehow closer, despite their desperate attempts to find him.
A disabled veteran who served his country for 25 years deserves better than being terrorized by cowards who prey on the helpless. The psychological pressure was working. Jake could see it in their body language, hear it in their voices. They were used to being the hunters, not the hunted. The sudden reversal of roles was destroying their confidence. "What do you want?" the gang member called Phantom asked, his voice cracking with fear. "Justice," Jake replied, "and to ensure you never target another veteran or anyone else in this neighborhood again." The warehouse fell silent as Jake's words echoed off the walls. The Crimson Serpents huddled together, no longer the confident predators who controlled these streets through intimidation. They were beginning to understand they had made a serious mistake. "You think you can scare us?" Carlos shouted, but his bravado was hollow. "We run these streets. We have connections. Back up!" "Your connections can't help you." Jake's voice came from above them now, as if he was in the rafters, watching them like a predator studying prey. "And your backup won't arrive in time to save you from the consequences of your choices." The lights in the warehouse suddenly went out, plunging the gang members into darkness. Jake had cut the power, using techniques learned from sabotage operations overseas. In the blackness, their fear multiplied. Every sound became a potential threat. Every shadow could hide an enemy. "Stay together," Carlos hissed, but his crew was already breaking discipline, some moving toward the exits, others freezing in place. The darkness was amplifying their paranoia, turning trained soldiers into frightened children. When the emergency lighting flickered on minutes later, the Crimson Serpents found themselves alone in the warehouse. But Jake had left behind evidence of his presence, items that shouldn't exist in civilian hands, technical equipment that spoke of military resources and capabilities far beyond what a local threat could possess.
"That equipment is worth more than you make in a year," Jake's voice came through hidden speakers placed during the blackout. "Each piece is designed to eliminate threats like you efficiently and permanently. The only question is whether you're smart enough to recognize when you're outmatched." Carlos stared at the devices scattered around the warehouse, recognition dawning in his eyes. He had seen similar equipment in military movies, knew enough to understand it represented capabilities his gang could never match. "Who are you, really?" Carlos asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who doesn't leave threats to his family unaddressed," Jake replied, the devices suddenly activating with red targeting lasers that swept across each gang member before focusing on Carlos himself. "You have 24 hours to make this right." The lasers shut off, and Jake's presence vanished from the warehouse, leaving the Crimson Serpents alone with their fear and the growing realization that they had targeted the wrong family. The devices remained behind, a constant reminder that they were being watched by someone with resources and skills far beyond their understanding. Back at his father's apartment, Jake found Marcus waiting up despite the late hour. His father's eyes searched his face, looking for answers about what had transpired during his hours away. "How did it go, son?" Marcus asked, quietly. "Phase 1 is complete," Jake replied, settling into a chair beside his father's borrowed wheelchair. "They're starting to understand they made a mistake targeting you." Marcus studied his son's face, noting the calm, professional demeanor that meant Jake was operating in his military mindset. "What exactly did you do?" "Applied pressure at strategic points," Jake explained, "disrupted their routine, challenged their security, made them question their own organization. They're used to being predators, Dad, not prey." "Jake, be careful," Marcus warned. "These aren't enemy combatants in a war zone. They're American citizens. Even if they're criminals, there are legal consequences to consider." "I understand the environment, Dad," Jake replied. "But some principles transcend legal jurisdictions. They attacked a veteran, destroyed property that represented your independence and dignity. There are consequences for that. Marcus reached over and gripped his son's shoulder, feeling the tension there, the weight of decisions that only someone with Jake's training and experience could fully understand. Just remember what I taught you, son. Use the minimum force necessary to achieve your objective. Excessive response creates more problems than it solves. Jake nodded, remembering childhood lessons about proportional response, about being the better man even when faced with injustice. Tomorrow, they'll have a chance to make things right. If they choose poorly, the response will escalate appropriately. What happens tomorrow? Marcus asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know. They demonstrate they understand the mistake they made, Jake replied, or they learn why targeting a SEAL's family is the worst decision they could possibly make. Miles away, Carlos Rodriguez sat in his expensive car, staring at the warehouse where they had encountered something beyond their understanding. His crew was scattered, some hiding, others talking about leaving Oakland altogether. The organization he had built through intimidation and violence was crumbling. "Viper, what do we do?" Tank asked through the cracked window, his massive frame somehow looking smaller than usual. "Whoever that was, they got resources we can't match." Carlos thought about the equipment they had seen, the voice that seemed to come from everywhere, the systematic destruction of their operations in a single day. This wasn't gang warfare or street violence. This was something else entirely. "Tomorrow we fix this," Carlos decided, his voice carrying grim determination. "We find that old soldier, we make this right, and we pray this ghost decides we learned our lesson." Because the alternative, Carlos realized, was facing an enemy who had spent 15 years learning how to eliminate threats permanently and without leaving evidence. The Crimson Serpents had wanted to teach a lesson about respect and consequences. Instead, they were about to learn those lessons themselves from someone who had perfected the art of warfare in places where mistakes were measured in body counts, not wounded pride. Dawn was coming, and with it, a reckoning that would change the balance of power in Oakland forever. The gang that had terrorized a neighborhood was about to discover what real terror looked like when delivered by a professional who had spent years protecting America from its enemies. Jake Thompson, the man they called Ghost, was giving them one chance to make things right. After that, the rules of engagement would change permanently.
The morning of reckoning dawned gray and overcast, as if the Oakland sky reflected the tension building in the streets below. Jake had given the Crimson Serpents 24 hours to make things right, and those hours were nearly up. He positioned himself at his observation post, watching the convenience store where it all began, waiting to see if Carlos Rodriguez had learned anything from the previous day's demonstrations. At exactly 0900 hours, Carlos arrived, but this time he was alone. No crew, no backup, just one man carrying what appeared to be a large package. Jake noted the gang leader's body language, nervous but determined. The swagger and arrogance were gone, replaced by something that might have been respect or fear. Marcus was waiting in his apartment, having refused Jake's suggestion to stay elsewhere until this was resolved. "I've never run from a fight, son, and I'm not starting now," Marcus had said, with the quiet dignity that had shaped Jake's understanding of courage and honor. The knock on the apartment door came at 09:15. Jake opened it to find Carlos Rodriguez standing in the hallway holding a brand-new wheelchair still in its packaging. The gang leader's eyes were downcast, his usual defiance replaced by something Jake had rarely seen in his enemies, genuine remorse. "Mr. Thompson," Carlos said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I came to return what we took from you." Jake studied the young man, noting the absence of weapons, the submissive posture, the way Carlos kept his hands visible and non-threatening. It was a start, but not enough to undo the damage that had been done. "My father's wheelchair was custom-made," Jake replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of command. "This is a replacement, not a restoration." "I know," Carlos said quickly, looking up to meet Jake's eyes. "I know we can't undo what we did, but I brought the receipt. It's the top-of-the-line model. Everything your father had and more.
I paid for it myself, not with drug money, with money I saved from my job before all this." Jake was surprised. This wasn't the response he had expected from a gang leader used to taking what he wanted through violence and intimidation. Something had changed in Carlos Rodriguez overnight, something beyond fear. "How did you know what model to buy?" Jake asked, stepping aside to allow Carlos into the apartment. "I asked around, found out where your father got his original chair, talked to the people there. They told me what he needed, what would work best." Carlos paused, looking around the modest apartment. "I also learned some things about your father that I should have known before." Marcus wheeled his borrowed chair into the living room, his weathered face impassive as he studied the young man who had humiliated him less than 48 hours earlier. "Mr. Thompson," Carlos said, turning to face Marcus directly, "I owe you an apology that goes deeper than just replacing your chair. What we did was wrong, not just criminal, but wrong in a way that goes against everything I was raised to believe." Marcus remained silent, waiting for Carlos to continue, his military bearing commanding respect even from someone who had attacked him. "My grandfather served in Vietnam," Carlos continued, his voice growing stronger. "He lost his arm in Da Nang, came home to a country that didn't want him, spent years fighting for benefits, fighting for respect. I grew up hearing his stories about what it meant to serve, and I forgot all of that when I started running with the Serpents." The admission hung in the air between them. Jake recognized the signs of genuine remorse, but remained cautious. Operational security demanded constant vigilance, even when the enemy appeared to be surrendering. "Your grandfather would be disappointed in what you became," Jake observed. "But more importantly, what are you going to do about what you are now?" Carlos reached into his pocket slowly, producing a folded piece of paper. "I wrote down the names and addresses of everyone who was there yesterday, who participated in what happened to your father. They all contributed money for the wheelchair, and they all want to apologize personally." Jake examined the list, noting that it included not just the core crew, but several associates who had been present during the attack. The level of cooperation suggested Carlos had used considerable influence to coordinate this response. "That's a start," Jake said, "but apologies don't change the fact that you terrorized this neighborhood for months, that you made people afraid to walk their own streets." "You're right," Carlos nodded. "I can't undo that either, but I can change what happens going forward. The Serpents are done in this neighborhood. We're pulling back to our original territory, and we're going to operate differently. No more targeting civilians, no more intimidation tactics." Jake studied Carlos's face, looking for signs of deception, for the calculated responses of someone playing an angle. Instead, he saw something unexpected, genuine transformation born from a night of facing consequences he had never imagined. "My father taught me that actions speak louder than words," Jake said. "What actions are you prepared to take?" Carlos straightened his shoulders, carrying himself with new purpose. "I'm disbanding the crew here, turning over our territory to community leaders, people who actually care about this neighborhood. I'm also cooperating with police on unsolved crimes, giving them information that will help clean up problems we created." The offer was more comprehensive than Jake had expected, but he remained skeptical. Gang leaders usually didn't volunteer to destroy their own organizations without ulterior motives.
"And what about you personally, Carlos?" Jake asked. "What's your plan for making amends beyond buying a wheelchair and making speeches?" "I'm enlisting," Carlos said simply. "My grandfather always said the military taught him discipline, gave him purpose, something bigger than himself to believe in. I should have listened to him years ago instead of choosing the streets." The silence that followed was profound. Marcus and Jake exchanged glances, both recognizing the significance of what they were hearing. Military service was not something most people chose as penance. It was a commitment that would fundamentally change Carlos's life. "The Army won't take someone with your criminal record," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Carlos nodded. "I know. I've already talked to a recruiter. They said there's a waiver process for people who want to turn their lives around. It'll take time, character references, proof that I've changed. but they said it's possible, especially with military family support. The last comment was directed at Marcus, a request, without being a demand, an acknowledgement that the man he had wronged held the key to his potential redemption. Marcus studied Carlos for a long moment, seeing something in the young man's eyes that reminded him of his own son years ago, when Jake had decided to dedicate his life to serving something greater than himself. "Supporting your enlistment doesn't erase what you did," Marcus said quietly, "but it might be a first step toward making amends to all the people you've hurt, including yourself." Carlos nodded, understanding the conditional nature of the offer. "I know, Mr. Thompson. I know I have years of work ahead of me to prove I've changed, but I'm ready to do it." Jake walked to the window, observing the street below where other Crimson Serpent members were approaching the building, each one carrying packages, flowers, or envelopes, their body language subdued and respectful. "Your crew is here," Jake announced. "They're all armed or carrying concealed weapons." "No weapons," Carlos said quickly. "I made that clear to everyone. We come here as petitioners, not as gang members. Anyone who brought heat was told to stay away." The next hour was unlike anything Jake had experienced in 15 years of military service. One by one, the gang members who had participated in the attack came to Marcus's apartment, each one offering personal apologies and contributions to replace what they had destroyed. Brick, the heavyset member who had wielded the baseball bat, broke down completely when he faced Marcus. "Sir, I've never hit a disabled person before that day. I don't know what got into me. My little brother has cerebral palsy, and if anyone ever hurt him like that, I'd want to kill them." Phantom, the wiry gang member who had grabbed Marcus's wallet during the struggle, returned it, along with all the cash that had been inside, plus additional money. "I kept thinking about what my grandmother would say if she knew what I did. She raised me better than this, Mr. Thompson." Tank, the largest of the crew, presented Marcus with a hand-carved wooden plaque. "My uncle made this in his shop. It's got your name and your service record. My uncle's a veteran too, Marine Corps. He said any man who served deserves respect, not what we gave you." Each apology was personal, specific, and accompanied by genuine emotion. Jake's training had taught him to recognize deception, to spot manipulation designed to exploit sympathy. What he saw instead was authentic remorse from young men who had been forced to confront the reality of their actions. The transformation was remarkable, but Jake remained cautious. Sustainable change required more than emotional apologies. It required structural modifications to prevent backsliding. "What guarantees do we have that this change is permanent?" Jake asked, as the last gang member finished his apology. "How do we know you won't revert to old patterns once the immediate consequences fade?" Carlos had prepared for this question. "I've given contact information for every former Serpent to community leaders. Mrs. Garcia downstairs has my personal phone number. So does Pastor Williams at the Baptist Church and Detective Morrison at Oakland PD. Anyone sees us causing problems, they have direct access to report it."
Jake nodded, appreciating the accountability structure. But he had one more test to apply, something that would reveal the depth of Carlos's commitment. "There's one more thing you need to understand," Jake said, his voice carrying the finality of command. "This neighborhood is under protection now, not just from me, but from resources you can't imagine. If any criminal organization tries to fill the vacuum you're leaving, they'll face consequences that make what happened to you look gentle." Carlos met Jake's eyes directly, understanding the message. "You're saying this is your father's neighborhood, and now that it's safe because you're watching over it." "I'm saying," Jake replied, "that veterans and their families deserve to live with dignity, and anyone who threatens that dignity will answer to people who've spent their lives learning how to eliminate threats permanently." The message was received. Carlos and his former crew members nodded their understanding. They had glimpsed enough of Jake's capabilities to know this wasn't an empty threat. 1 week later,
Marcus Thompson sat in his new wheelchair outside the convenience store where the attack had occurred. But this time, he wasn't alone. Mrs. Garcia sat on a nearby bench with her grandson, Miguel, while Pastor Williams chatted with Detective Morrison about community policing initiatives. The street looked the same, but felt completely different. Gone were the red bandanas and intimidating stares. The corner that had been controlled by gang members was now occupied by local teenagers playing basketball, using a hoop someone had installed over the weekend. Jake watched from a distance as his father navigated his new chair, testing its features, and clearly pleased with its performance. The custom modifications Carlos had purchased made it superior to the original wheelchair, giving Marcus capabilities he had never had before. "Son," Marcus called, waving Jake over. "This chair is incredible. The controls are so responsive, and look at this." He demonstrated the elevation feature that allowed him to raise his seat height for better interaction with standing individuals. Jake approached, noting the relaxed expressions of the neighborhood residents, the way children played freely without looking over their shoulders. The transformation was complete, but he remained vigilant. Threats could emerge from unexpected directions. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you," Jake said, settling onto a nearby bench. "The situation here is stable, but my leave is almost up. I have to report back for duty in 3 days. Marcus nodded, understanding the reality of military service, but also recognizing something in his son's expression. "What aren't you telling me, Jake?" "I've been offered a position stateside," Jake said carefully, "training new SEAL teams at Coronado. It would mean no more deployments, no more classified missions, just passing on what I've learned to the next generation." The offer was real and attractive, but Jake hesitated, because leaving felt like abandoning his father again, leaving him vulnerable to whatever threats might emerge in his absence. Marcus studied his son's face, seeing the conflict there between duty to country and duty to family. It was a choice Marcus had faced himself years ago, when Jake's mother was dying, when military service competed with family obligations. "Jake," Marcus said finally, "this neighborhood is safe not because you scared some gang members, but because the community learned to stand up for itself. They don't need a guardian anymore. They've become guardians themselves." The wisdom in his father's words resonated with Jake's own observations over the past week. Residents had organized themselves into informal security networks, looking out for each other in ways that made external protection unnecessary. "Besides," Marcus continued with a slight smile, "Carlos stops by every Tuesday to help me with shopping and physical therapy appointments. Having a former gang leader as a personal assistant is surprisingly effective at deterring other problems." Jake laughed, recognizing his father's ability to find humor even in serious situations. It was a trait that had sustained Marcus through combat, injury, and adaptation to civilian life. 3 days later, Jake stood in Oakland International Airport, preparing to board his flight to San Diego. His duffel bag contained everything he owned, a reflection of 15 years spent living out of military bases and forward operating posts. Carlos had driven him to the airport, an arrangement that would have seemed impossible just 2 weeks earlier. The young man had cut his hair, adopted civilian clothes, and carried himself with the bearing of someone preparing for military service. "Mr. Jake," Carlos said as they shook hands at the security checkpoint, "I wanted you to know that your father isn't just getting help from me anymore. The whole neighborhood looks out for him. He's become like a grandfather to kids who never had positive male role models." Jake nodded, recognizing that his father had found something perhaps more valuable than protection. He had found community, purpose, and the respect he had always deserved. "Take care of yourself, Carlos," Jake said, And remember that military service isn't about proving you're tough. It's about learning to be part of something bigger than yourself. I understand now, Carlos replied. My grandfather was right all those years ago about what the military could teach me about discipline, honor, and serving something greater than my own interests. 6 months later, Jake was settled into his new assignment training the next generation of Navy SEALs when he received a package from Oakland. Inside was a newspaper clipping about a local hero ceremony honoring veterans in the community. The photo showed Marcus Thompson in his wheelchair accepting a community service award surrounded by neighbors, including several young men Jake recognized as former Crimson Serpents.
The accompanying letter was from his father, updating him on neighborhood developments. Carlos had successfully enlisted and was excelling in basic training. 2 other former gang members had enrolled in community college, while the remaining crew members had found legitimate employment through programs coordinated by local churches. But the most important news was personal. Marcus had started dating Mrs. Garcia, whose husband had died 2 years earlier. They had bonded over their shared experiences of military life and loss, finding companionship that enriched both their lives. Jake smiled, reading his father's words, recognizing the contentment that came through in every line. The mission was complete, not just the tactical objective of neutralizing a threat, but the larger goal of ensuring his father could live with dignity and happiness. The Oakland neighborhood continued its transformation, becoming a model for community organization and mutual support. Visitors came from other cities, seeking to understand how an area once controlled by criminal organizations had become one of the safest and most cohesive communities in California. The secret, Jake knew, was not in military intervention or outside protection, but in helping people discover their own strength, their own capacity to stand up for what was right. When properly supported and organized, ordinary citizens could accomplish extraordinary things. Marcus Thompson had received more than a replacement wheelchair. He had regained his place as a respected member of a community that valued his service and his wisdom. The gang members had discovered that true respect came not from intimidation, but from contribution to something larger than themselves. And Jake Thompson had learned that sometimes the most important missions happen not in foreign battlefields, but in the neighborhoods where heroes live quietly among us, deserving recognition, protection, and the chance to age with dignity. The story of what happened in Oakland spread through military networks, becoming a legend of sorts, about a SEAL who came home to defend his father but ended up transforming an entire community. It demonstrated that the best operations are not those that eliminate enemies, but those that create lasting, positive change. Years later, when asked about the incident, Jake would say that his father had taught him everything he needed to know about courage, honor, and protecting those who could not protect themselves. The rest had simply been applying those lessons with the tools and training the Navy had provided. Some battles, Jake reflected, are won not through superior firepower, but through superior character and the willingness to stand up for what is right, regardless of the personal cost. His father had always understood this, and now a whole community shared that understanding. The wheelchair had been replaced, but more importantly, the dignity, respect, and security that had been stolen were restored, not just for one veteran, but for everyone who deserved to live without fear in their own neighborhood. That, Jake realized, was a victory worth fighting for.